As I read the scripture from the gospel today, I'm guessing that some of you were thinking, this is the Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus' most famous sermon and the lengthiest body of his teaching that we have in any passage almost. But even though the similarities to Matthew's recountal of the Sermon on the Mount are obvious, Luke's passage has notable differences, and those differences, I think, are worth noting. First of all, it's not presented on a mount, not a high place. Verse 17 said, Jesus came down with them, meaning the disciples, from the mountain where they had been praying, and they came to a level place where Jesus taught and healed and comforted the gathered crowd. So this is not called the Sermon on the Mount. This, in Luke, is called the Sermon on the Plain, the level place. There are other differences between this and Matthew's narrative too, leading to much discussion and debate. Theologians love these things, But the reality is we don't know if Jesus taught similar sermons in different places or if the gospel writers emphasized different things as they told their remembrances of time with Jesus and his stories shared about his earthly ministry. So we'll not haggle about which possibility seems the most reasonable to us. We need to leave some fodder for discussion to the more serious theologians, as they earn their livelihood by such scrutinizing. And thanks be to God, though, that they do that they give us more of their insight to consider these things further. But for our purposes today, we'll just take Luke at his word that Jesus came off the mountain and he was fueled and energized by prayer, and he began to heal and teach the people that he'd gathered into a crowd. Now, in real estate, they used to say, well, maybe they still do, but I'm no longer married to a real estate agent. Well, wait, I'm actually still married to someone who used to be a real estate agent. So I'm still married to Warren, but he no longer sells real estate. That's what I mean. But they used to say, what are the top 3 things that sell a house? And the top 3 things are location, location, location. So while Luke masterfully uses location in this passage to tell us much about Jesus and his ministry, first we see that he came down. Physically, Jesus walked down to the level of the people there, and it mirrors his descent from heaven right to us in a fallen and needy and desperate world. Furthermore, the multitude gathered are from varied locations. Did you notice that as well? All Judea, Jerusalem, and the coasts of Tyre and Sidon. Locations included within the range of Jesus' ministry, and people from locations that were outside that listing. In that listing, we can assume that Jesus attended to the needs of all without discrimination and without favoritism. Jews and Gentiles are together there, and Jesus ministered healing, exorcisms, and the same words of teaching to all. There was not a lesson to the Jewish people gathered and another to the Gentiles. It was on level ground. So, to return to the metaphor that I talked to the children about of learning to walk with Jesus, consider that we learn to walk on level ground. No reasonable or kind parent would encourage a baby learning to walk to try the stairs first, right? We gate the stairs to prevent falls, and we practice with them on the safest and most level surfaces available, those that provide the softest fall. That's where we begin. And that's exactly where Luke sets this narrative, right on the level plane, right where people live with all the ordinariness of life and its challenges. There are more notable comparisons with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Matthew's version has a spiritualized interpretation of some of the statements. So Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." But Luke says, blessed are you who are poor. Matthew says, blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness. But Luke says that Jesus says, blessed are you that are hungry right now. The Lucan version is much shorter. There's no blessing of the meek or the merciful, the pure in heart or the peacemakers. Nothing so elevated, so to speak, as with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. These folks are not necessarily hungering and thirsting for righteousness. They're hungering for food. They aren't just poor in spirit, they're poor. They are the day laborers without security for what tomorrow brings, what they'll have to eat. They're the widows and the orphans in a time where there's no safety nets to help, and so on and so on. Jesus is right there where real people live. He's on the level with them in every way that might be understood. And he ministers to them as whole people, meeting physical and mental and spiritual needs right where they are. Maybe that's what makes this the perfect text for All Saints and Reformation Sunday, because we tend to think of saints with a capital S as those who have lived extraordinary lives or faith journeys that seem far out of reach in our ordinary existence. We think of them on pedestals, high and exalted. They're up there hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and here I am, just hungry most of the time. But that's where Jesus met them, and that is where he meets us. We learn to walk on level ground because you have to start somewhere. Jesus blesses them where they are and teaches them to walk like him and with him, trusting God, loving and serving others, not staying apart from them, but entering in by coming to their place. Love that overcomes evil. And a parenthetical word here, because whenever passages like this are read that speak of offering the other cheek to be struck, I can't let it pass without naming abusive relationships. Our church supports Willow domestic violence services because domestic violence is so destructive and demeaning to the personhood of those who have been or are currently living without abuse. Some people would say, well, Willow, is that a Christian organization? Well, they are doing the work of peacemakers and helping people get out of abusive relationships. So that's Christian. God is not instructing anyone to live in an abusive relationship, but to get out and to get safe. But neither does God allow us to live in the prison of anger or bitterness or retribution that sometimes you can fall into when you are a victim. Learning to walk with Jesus is sometimes hard. And probably of all the hard things Jesus said, loving enemies might be the hardest of all the instructions that Jesus gives. But it's also the goal. In sign language, the sign for enemy is the one who thinks differently. Not someone who does some great harm to you, but just the one that thinks differently. If you're on social media much, you've understood that sometimes people have made the one that thinks differently into a great enemy. So maybe just starting there is where we learn to walk. When we walk with Jesus without dragging our feet or pulling away, he can love through us, even in those cases where we cannot muster up a holy attitude on our own. It's easy to put some people in a place of honor and assume that we'll never be used of God in some great way like that. But Jesus' instructions here are pretty simple. Start loving your enemy. The names of the reformers and the prophetic voices through time, and those with great witnesses or preaching skills, those who've evidenced incredibly strong faith, maybe those are the people that we think of as saints. And they would be the people on the Mount, right? They're the Sermon on the Mount kind of folks. But our remembrance of those people are often sanitized views of the reality of their lives, of their biographies. They too, like us, had their days on the level and low places. They too made mistakes when they were learning to walk with God. Sometimes they did well, and sometimes they stumbled. Karl Barth says this, and he says this generally of all the saints. We need openness towards particular figures, an understanding of the circumstances in which they worked, much patience and a good sense of humor when we consider their obvious limitations and weaknesses, a little grace in expressing even the most profound criticisms, and finally, even in the worst cases, a certain tranquil delight that they were as they were, learning to walk with Jesus. Most saints, a little s, like us, will never be remembered by statues or biographies, maybe. However, taking our place in God's story and walking that holy walk as well as we're able is significant. Remember, Jesus came right down to where we live, to the hurt and the need. And then there's the woes. Jesus didn't just say, some of you are blessed, but he gave woes. Woe to you if you are well fed now, and by association, unconcerned about others who are hungry. Woe to you, because that is something that you will have corrected in the opposite way. So just as they learned what was blessed, then they also learned the correctives like a snap of the leash, like I do with Phoebe, not to be cruel, but to bring her to a right place so she fellowships with me perfectly and is safe in the process, I might say. Those corrective snaps of our metaphorical leashes, if we value the world and its goods ahead of external treasures, are necessary too. The way we walk with Christ helps others as we all learn together. I'm going to name just a few people in my mind who did nothing great but helped me learn what it means to walk with God. This past week, one of my favorite professors from Houghton passed away, Richard Jacobson. And he was a math professor and a brilliant mind, but he had the most intense stutter that you can imagine. The very first time I was in a prayer meeting and they asked him to pray and he was praying, I started to get up to do the Heimlich maneuver because I thought he was choking. He had such a stutter, and yet he put himself out there in front of other people. And when he was stuttering, he would draw little geometric shapes in the air to help him get out the words. And he, Jake Jacobson, taught me what it means to live gracefully with a disability at a time before I knew I would ever develop a disability. My parents, with overwhelming generosity. Now, some people are generous and they might have people over for a meal or overnight. My parents took a homeless man in who lived with us 53 years until his death. He never was turned out. That's generosity that speaks to my heart. My Aunt Treva and Uncle John and my grandparents, the Eisman grandparents, were faithful and consistent in this little country church in Garwoods where I used to go as a child and as a young adult. And I can just come in my mind through the doors, and the door came into the side of the church instead of the back. And I can see where Aunt Treva and Uncle John would be sitting, and I can see where my grandparents were sitting every week. And for me, even as a young age, I learned that being a saint was taking your place among the faithful. And you might not think that just coming to church on Sunday is a very loud testimony, overwhelming testimony to someone else, but it can be. There are children watching you. There are young Christians that are watching. Taking your place among the faithful. Remembering the faithful and that their testimony still speaks and that they still will live in our memories and in their example shining forth to us when they're long gone. Most of you are probably familiar with Archbishop Oscar Romero from El Salvador. He was Archbishop there during a brutal period of time. And he spoke out for the people against the oppressions that he saw in the government. And he was murdered at the altar, murdered during the Eucharist. But he had this practice while he was living. During the Eucharist, he would name the names of the members of the community who had just disappeared that week or had been called home during the previous week to the church triumphant. And as the prayers of the community were spoken, the names would be lifted up one after another, and the congregation would respond to each name by boldly proclaiming, "Presente." They're present. The memories of those that have lived a walk with Jesus before us are present, and our memory will be present to the others that come after. May it be so.